So I'm currently reading a book by Blake Chastain called Exvangelical and Beyond: How American Christianity Went Radical and the Movement That's Fighting Back. And it's helpful on a lot of fronts. But one of the most helpful things for me has been the way that he recounts the story of evangelicalism, which is the story I grew up in. I keep reading and going, oh, that's why that was the way it was. And that's why it's this way today. So I want to give a kind of 30,000 foot overview of that story. And if that's interesting to you, I recommend you get a copy of this book. The story essentially goes like this. The story of evangelicalism as I came into it is essentially the story of the creation of a culture. Its definition doesn't really start with a set of theological beliefs, which is what I would have thought, but more with a vibe. Early on, the name evangelical was associated essentially with anyone who participated in religious revivals, which marked a cultural distinction between evangelicals and, say, more liturgical or liberal traditions. Although it would later be defined by these kind of common theological tendencies, which included things like valuing conversion, the centrality of the Bible, the power of Jesus to save you from hell, and the need to go out and evangelize others. But it should be pointed out that even with those common threads, evangelicals through history have shown themselves willing to do all kinds of theological gymnastics for the sake of protecting a particular kind of culture, because that's what it's really about. And that culture, as we know it, really gets rolling in the 19th century with the rise of folks like D.L. Moody, who encourages businessmen to start gathering for a noon-hour prayer meeting. And it works, and certain ideas start to arise out of these spaces and these networks. Being white male businessmen who have proven themselves pretty good at capitalistic success, we start to see a Christianity that really values individualism and self-reliance, that consciously or unconsciously is pretty invested in protecting the systems that gave these men status, namely capitalism and patriarchy and white supremacy. Now, a vision soon emerges from these networks consisting basically of two prongs. First, there's Christian education, starting with colleges, and over the next several decades branching out into education of all levels, including especially homeschools. And second, there's Christian media, initially books and publishing companies, but again, over the next several decades, branching out into Christian movies, Christian music, and they create this Christian consumer culture where they create the media that evangelicals will consume. And Christian education provides the consumers. And over time, it produces this perfect evangelical cultural consumer bubble, a feedback loop. And once again, this is a bubble that continues to be deeply rooted in protecting these systems of capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy, selectively emphasizing theology that protects those interests, like an emphasis on individual salvation from hell, individual sin and accountability, and downplaying any kind of societal institutional sin. And then there's this big shift that happens in the 50s with Brown versus Board of Education. Many of these Christian schools had been founded as segregation academies, so folks could protect their Christian value of not sending their white kids to school with non-white kids. But when these institutions' tax-exempt status starts to be threatened because they refuse to integrate, it shook evangelicals into action to try to gain more power in the broader culture, leading to the creation of the religious right, and leading them to partner with Catholic groups, which would have been previously unthinkable, who had similar social concerns. Which is why, out of nowhere, evangelicals start caring about abortion. Whereas before, many evangelicals were either pro-choice or didn't see the issue as a big deal. And here you start to see a shift in that cultural identity, placing an even greater emphasis on political aims. Specifically, the aim of reconstructing all society so that it was under the dominion of the Lord. A theocracy, essentially, with white evangelical leadership serving as the theos. And this is where I was born into the story. This is the system that I inherited. One in which theological convictions are typically just political convictions in disguise, where evangelicalism is first and foremost marked by creating a culture where there are insiders and outsiders, where the insiders consume all the right media and vote in all the right ways, and the outsiders are just poor lost sinners, where we have been tricked into taking the patriarchal, white supremacist, capitalistic Christianity of businessmen and just calling it biblical Christianity. That is the story I have spent the last several years of my life waking up to and trying to resist. But here's the deal. Like all stories, because this story has a beginning and an arc, it can also have an end. It is shapeable by the characters that currently play a role in its unfolding. And that means me and you. And waking up to the story we're in is the first step in taking control of the next chapter.